Hey, Stories of the Soul fam! We've got a swoon-worthy love story for you today. Let's jump in and tell us what cities are, David. Chen pushed open the glass door of Sunrise Coffee every morning at exactly 7:15. The bell chimed softly, announcing his arrival to the same barista who had worked there for the past 8 months. Her name tag read Jasmine, and she always smiled when she saw him approach the counter. "Good morning, David. The usual?" Jasmine asked, her voice warm and welcoming. "Yes, please." "Large black coffee, no sugar," David replied, keeping his eyes focused on the counter. He handed over the exact change and stepped aside to wait, pulling out his phone to avoid any further conversation. This routine had continued for months. David worked as a software developer for a tech company downtown, spending most of his day behind 3 monitors, writing code in solitude. His apartment was quiet, his weekends were spent alone, and his phone rarely rang with anything other than work calls. Back at his desk, David stared at lines of code that made perfect sense to him. Programming languages were logical, predictable, and safe. Unlike human conversations, there were clear rules and expected outcomes. When he wrote a function, it either worked or it didn't. There was no gray area. No hidden meanings, no fear of saying the wrong thing. His coworker, Rachel Kim, often tried to include him in lunch plans or after-work gatherings, but David always politely declined. It wasn't that he disliked people. In fact, he desperately wanted to connect with others. He had thoughts, opinions, and stories he wanted to share. But every time he opened his mouth to contribute to a conversation, the words seemed to stick in his throat. David had always been this way. In school, he was the quiet kid who knew all the answers but never raised his hand. In college, he preferred studying alone to group projects. Now, at 28, he realized he had built invisible walls around himself so high that he couldn't see over them anymore. One rainy Tuesday morning, David arrived at Sunrise Coffee to find an elderly man sitting alone at his usual corner table. The man looked to be in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was reading a newspaper and drinking tea from a ceramic mug. As David waited for his coffee, he noticed the man was reading an article about artificial intelligence in healthcare. It was a topic David knew well, something he had actually worked on in his previous job. For a brief moment, he considered approaching the stranger to share his insights. The moment passed. David took his coffee and headed toward the door. "Excuse me," the elderly man called out. "You're here every morning, aren't you?" "I'm Mr. Peterson. I've been coming here for about a month now." David stopped, his hand on the door handle. He turned around slowly. "I'm David. Yes, I come here most mornings. Would you like to sit for a moment? I'm just reading about these new AI developments in medicine. Fascinating stuff, though I'll admit most of it goes over my head." David hesitated. He glanced at Jasmine behind the counter, who gave him an encouraging nod. Something about Mr. Peterson's gentle manner made David feel less anxious than usual. "I actually know something about that topic," David said quietly, walking back toward the table. For the next 20 minutes, David found himself explaining machine learning algorithms and data analysis in ways that Mr. Peterson could understand. The older man listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest. "You know," Mr. Peterson said as David prepared to leave for work, "I've been coming to coffee shops for 40 years, and I can usually tell when someone has a lot to say, but keeps it inside. You have that look?" David felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm not very good at talking to people, son. It's a difference between being good at talking and having something worth saying. You clearly have plenty worth saying. The world needs to hear it." That evening, David sat in his apartment thinking about his conversation with Mr. Peterson. For the first time in months, he had felt truly engaged with another person. He wasn't trying to be charming or funny or impressive. He was just sharing something he knew and cared about. He realized that what he craved wasn't romance or popularity or even friendship in the traditional sense. He just wanted to be heard. He wanted to feel like his thoughts and experiences mattered to someone, anyone. David opened his laptop and began typing. Not code this time, but words. He wrote about his work, his ideas, his fears, and his dreams. He wrote about feeling invisible in a world full of noise. He wrote about the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people, but never truly connecting with them. As he wrote, David began to understand something important. He had been waiting for someone to give him permission to speak, but the permission had to come from himself. He had been so afraid of being judged that he had judged himself into silence. The next morning, David walked into Sunrise Coffee with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was ready to find his voice. David walked into Sunrise Coffee the next morning carrying a small leather notebook. Mr. Peterson was already at his usual table, reading what appeared to be a book about gardening. "Good morning, David," Mr. Peterson said, looking up with a smile. "You look different today, more determined." David ordered his coffee and, without hesitation, walked over to Mr. Peterson's table. "May I sit? I wanted to thank you for yesterday. That conversation meant more to me than you might realize." "Of course. Sit down. I'm glad it helped. You know, I used to be a counselor before I retired, 43 years of listening to people. One thing I learned is that everyone has a story worth telling, but not everyone knows how to tell it." Mr. Peterson gestured to the notebook in David's hands. "What's that you've got there?" "I started writing last night. It's about my thoughts, my work, things I've never said out loud. You mentioned that I have things worth saying, so I thought I'd start getting them down on paper first." "Smart approach. Sometimes we need to hear our own voice before we can share it with others." "What did you discover when you started writing?" "I wrote about how I've been treating conversations like programming problems. I was looking for perfect syntax and error-free execution. But human connection doesn't work that way." Over the following weeks, David's morning conversations with Mr. Peterson became the highlight of his day. They talked about technology, philosophy, books, and life experiences. Mr. Peterson shared stories from his counseling days, while David opened up about his work and his struggles with social anxiety. Jasmine began joining their conversations during slower morning periods. She brought her own perspective as someone who had moved to the city from a small town and had to learn how to connect with strangers every day. "You know what I noticed about you, David?" Jasmine said one morning as she refilled their coffee cups. "You're actually a really good listener. When Mr. Peterson talks, you don't just wait for your turn to speak. You actually process what he's saying and respond thoughtfully." David looked surprised. "I never thought of myself as good with people." "Being good with people isn't about being the loudest person in the room," Mr. Peterson added. "It's about being present, showing genuine interest, and making others feel valued. You do all of those things naturally." This observation changed something in David's mindset. He had been so focused on his fear of speaking that he had unrecognized his natural ability to listen and connect. Back at work, David began to notice his coworker Rachel in a new way. She often ate lunch alone at her desk while working, just like he did. One day he approached her workstation. "Rachel, would you like to grab lunch together today? There's a sandwich place down the street I've been wanting to try." Rachel looked up, surprised but pleased. "I'd love that. I was just thinking about how quiet the office gets during lunch." During their meal, David discovered that Rachel was also dealing with feelings of isolation. She had moved to the city for this job 6 months ago and was struggling to make friends outside of work. "I've been so focused on proving myself professionally that I forgot about the personal side of life," Rachel admitted. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm talking to my computer more than to actual people." David found himself sharing his own experiences with loneliness. In his recent conversations with Mr. Peterson and Jasmine, he was amazed at how natural it felt to open up, when he focused on understanding Rachel rather than worrying about how he sounded. Inspired by his growing confidence, David started a small lunch group at work for anyone who wanted to discuss technology trends and their personal projects. What started as 3 people grew to 8 within a month. "I can't believe you organized this," Rachel said after one particularly engaging discussion about artificial intelligence ethics. 6 months ago, you barely said hello in the hallways." David reflected on her comment. "And I was so afraid of being judged that I forgot people might actually want to hear what I have to say." Mr. Peterson helped me realize that my fear of speaking was really a fear of not mattering. One morning, David arrived at Sunrise Coffee to find a young woman sitting alone at a corner table, looking anxious and isolated. She had been coming in for a few days, always ordering quickly and leaving without making eye contact with anyone. David recognized the look. He had worn it himself for years. After getting his coffee, he approached her table. "Excuse me, I hope I'm not intruding, but you look like you might be new to the area." "David, I'm here most mornings if you ever want to sit with someone." The woman looked up, surprised. "I'm Jennifer. I just started a job downtown last week." "I don't really know anyone in the city yet. I understand that feeling completely. Would you like to join my friends and me? We usually sit over there and talk about whatever's on our minds. No pressure, just friendly conversation. As Jennifer hesitantly joined their group, David caught Mr. Peterson's eye. The older man smiled and nodded approvingly. Later that morning, as David walked to work, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He realized that what he had been searching for wasn't romance or even traditional friendship. He had needed something more fundamental, the experience of being truly heard and understood. For years he had believed that his thoughts and feelings didn't matter to anyone. He had convinced himself that he was boring, awkward, and forgettable. But through his conversations with Mr. Peterson, Jasmine, Rachel, and now Jennifer, he discovered that everyone carries interesting stories and valuable perspectives. The transformation hadn't made him an extrovert or a natural performer. He was still quiet, still thoughtful, still more comfortable with small groups than large crowds. But he had learned the difference between being quiet by choice and being silent from fear. David pulled out his phone and sent a text to Rachel. "Thanks for having lunch with me yesterday. Want to try that new Thai place today?" Her response came quickly. "Absolutely. And thank you for helping me feel less alone in this city." As David put his phone away, he smiled. He had found his voice not by becoming someone different, but by accepting who he already was and sharing that person with others. The greatest gift wasn't being heard by everyone, but being truly understood by a few people who mattered. In helping others feel less alone, David had discovered he was no longer alone himself. Sometimes the most profound connections happen not through grand romantic gestures, but through simple acts of listening, understanding, and being present for another person's story.